this is like a common debate in the space, right? To what extent do we use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house? And in some ways, I think it's a false binary and a false construct. In the sense that I would approach it from a non-dualistic perspective and say, firstly, it depends which of the master's tools we're talking about. Not all tools are created equally. There's this assumption that all the master's tools are somehow equally efficacious. And some of their tools are self-destructive and self-defeating, and some of the master's tools might be really useful. And in some ways, what matters more is context, right? Also, the idea that the master's house is worth reconstructing or worth occupying or worth demolishing or what have you. And I'm not sure that's the case. It may be that what we're creating is more of a palimpsest, layer on layer on layer, like an art collage. And that the master's house will be the rubble on which other things are built. And in that sense, we may not need the master's house or the master's tools in any way that we would recognize. Now, in another sense, if we think of this as a co-collective reconstruction project, and the only tools other people understand are the master's tools, let's give an example, rational thinking, the use of capital, then I think part of the strategy is like a jiu-jitsu strategy, is we're not going to amputate rationality. We're not going to amputate materialism. Our Occidental gaze has conditioned us, entrained us, socialized us to see the world in that way. So instead of trying to amputate it, how do you work with it? And instead of rationality, there's transrationality, where rationality is one stream feeding into the river of other ways of knowing, being, seeing, and relating to the world. That's a possibility. Where capital could be used to create post-capitalist infrastructure, right? Capital could be used to liberate capital. Capital, for all its ills, is a way to organize human labor. Right now, I can't exchange yucca for the participation of other coworkers in my community to build a structure. I may be able to do that in 10, 20 years. That may be the only currency in my bioregion. So the question is not let's not use capital or let's use capital. How do we do it in a way that is conscious of the shadow and the consequences of capital, and at the same time has intention to recalibrate and reorient what that capital is doing and why? So, New Age people often say, money is just energy, right? We've all heard this trope. Money is just energy. Well, if that was the case, the richest people would not be the most psychotic, sickest hoarders on the planet. They would have an abundance of energy, but they don't have an abundance of energy. They have an abundance of illness. So clearly money is something else. It's not just a means of exchange, as an economist would tell us. It's carrying 5,000 years of hierarchy, patriarchy, separation from the living world, white supremacy. It's carrying 500 to 600 years of the debt-based fiat logic, including the imperialism and the genocide and the colonialism that came with the expansion of Western European capital into the West. We had many ways of acquiring goods and services: bartering, hunting, trading, fishing, gifting. And now we have one way to acquire goods and services, which is debt-based capital, printed by the state and imposed on indigenous populations in the so-called New World, in places like Turtle Island and Latin America. And so now there's only one way to acquire goods and services. If an indigenous Alaskan person wants to fish on their ancestral waterways, they have to pay $2,000 fee for their license from the US state and work some bullshit job at Starbucks or whatever to pay for that. So everything is mediated by capital. And so when we're using the master's tools, like capital or like rationality, we have to understand that there's a level of consciousness and sensitivity that is required in using that tool, that we don't leave the entanglement with that tool unscarred, that there's this perpetual scarification, this perpetual layering over in the palimpsest of using the master's tools. And so there's awareness of the historical precedent, of the structural understanding of how this capital gets to be, what it is, and how we prop it up, our implication and complicity with it, and then also what it's doing to us. And I think if you can approach it in that way, then we could, for example, use capital to liberate capital. We can, for example, use rationality to explain the absurdity of reductionist, rationalist logic. And of course, all of these tools have their limitations. Language is never going to be able to describe the ineffable. Does that mean I'm against language? Absolutely not. What other choice do we have but to use the thing even though we know it's not going to be able to fulfill its teleology, its end purpose? And yet you have to try. There's a Carlos Castaneda line where he says, the warrior's task is to do what they must, even though they know it's futile. To be incarnated in the Anthropocene, in the midst of late-stage capitalism, with peak patriarchy, peak hierarchy, peak white supremacy, peak stupidity, is also peak possibility. And so you have to incorporate, metabolize the tools you have at hand in order to create, let's say, new, ancient, emerging possibilities. Whatever comes next, you have to build with what you have. And even the designation that these are the master's tools reinforces the master-slave dialectic, right? The master's tools were actually created by 1,000 generations of people who came before. The roads that were built, the schools and infrastructure that was built, the flush toilet. Think about how many generations of labor it took, right? The water that moves through those pipes when it's flushed. We are entangled with this broader meshwork, both materially and more than materially. And the distinction and ownership of these tools by the so-called master gives the so-called master too much power. Clearly, the current structure, with all its subsidies and trade rules, and is not only actively harming the world and all of us, it's preventing us from creating what I would call new, ancient, emerging systems, which is not some new localization, but it's actually returning to our ancestral ways of being in symbiosis with the living world. And because the power structures, as they really are, is preventing that, I think we have to co-opt jiu-jitsu, hack, dismantle existing structures and use that system, including capital, including rationality, including others of the so-called master's tools. No doubt about it. The idea that there's going to be a localization movement, I have some issue with, because I don't believe there can be a movement in that sense. I think there can be multiple movements with shared values and shared intention and shared ontologies. Ways of being in the world, ways of seeing the world outside of materialist, rationalist, reductionist separation. Do I think knowledge is going to, or more awareness is going to change our current predicament? It feels like a necessary but not sufficient condition. This idea in communications theory of the awareness behavior gap. All we have to do is close this gap with knowledge, and as people's awareness changes, behavior changes. Well, we have 100 years of modern media to tell us that's not the case at all. And that what awareness can do is co-create an architecture and an infrastructure that amplifies ignorance, but does not necessarily amplify consciousness. So more information can give me an alibi to behave in terrible ways, right? And which is kind of how we end up in this post-truth space. What media is really good at is activating the lowest aspects of ourselves, because it's some disembodied voice from elsewhere, where when you're in deep relationality, when you're in an embedded culture with elders, and they tell you something, they give you information, the likelihood of the awareness behavior gap having a synapse is much higher. We think all awareness is somehow equal, just like we think all the master's tools are somehow equal in their stature, in their value, in their efficacy. But relationality matters. And so when a media that I don't trust, with by definition, mediated talking heads and bodies elsewhere, giving us awareness and knowledge about certain things, can trigger certain aspects of us, but I don't think it's going to shift our deepest ontologies, our cosmologies, our perceptions of who we are and how we behave in the world. I think that requires community, that requires a deep spiritual practice, and that requires a willingness and desire and humility to put our foreheads to the soil and ask the living world for guidance. And what we could do is help create the conditions for that possibility, but there is agency and self-will to a certain extent. I don't believe in pure agency, but I also don't believe in predeterminacy, that the universe meets us halfway. Yeah. That superpositions of possibility cohere in space-time when we are in presence and in relationality and in kinship and in interaction with the beingness of what's happening. And that's going to require a lot more than information. Let's just address it head on, right? The irony and apparent paradox of people flying from around the world to meet for a conference on localization. And in some ways, it's a kind of weak and cheap critique, because people need to gather, and not just for the sake of relationality, but for the sake of understanding other local contexts that we can learn from, and also for the sake of seeing other people's embodiment, because it's not just about an awareness behavior gap, and more knowledge is going to solve that problem. We have to see the embodiment of how people live and relate in the world, and that shifts us. When we meet a Ladakhi elder, or we meet an Indian farmer who's on the front lines in a high conflict zone, telling us what they're learning, that shifts our neural nets, that shifts our embodiment, that shifts our understanding of how we need to respond to this moment. And it's necessary. Localization is not nationalism, it's not patriotism, it's not love of place in direct battle with some kind of cosmopolitan, larger concern. It's living your embodiment and your truth in place as an understanding that this is a fractal reflection of how we want broader systems to operate. And localization, just like bioregionalism, only works well when the systems that are in place at a superstructural level are in support of that. So the global feeds the local, and the local feeds the global, and the two perspectives are necessary. We want global travel. We want to learn from other cultures. We want to have a cosmopolitan refinement of our sensibilities through new experiences and novelty and experiential interaction. And simultaneously, we want to be deeply of place in intimate relationship to the ecology that holds us, molds us, shapes us, defines our consciousness. Right, we actually can't have localization if global power structures are invested in a corporate state nexus that's sole job is to undermine our livelihoods, our life force, our well-being. And so we have to organize to change global polity, global superstructures, and we have to live the lives that matter to us in ways that are in symbiosis with the living world in a place-based way. These are both necessary prerequisites for living post-capitalist lives worth living. There's been this kind of historic divide between, let's broadly, for the sake of argumentation, say the left and the New Age, right? The left have historically been materialist rationalists, Marxism, historical materialism, material dialectics, all of that, right? And the New Age, which has been almost phobic of critique, right? That we're creating separation and judgment and what have you. And there's a line in Post Capitalist Philanthropy where we say, if you do not have a critique of capitalist modernity, you are contextually irrelevant. But if all you have is a critique, you are spiritually and creatively impoverished. And so the first part of that is to the New Age. If you don't have a critique of capitalist modernity, of the oxygen we're breathing, of the water we're swimming in, you cannot be contextually relevant, because this is the context. You're going to come up with really bad ideas like social entrepreneurship and green growth and cryptocurrency and geoengineering and replicating the same problems because we're not being informed by the context. And then the second part of that is, if all you have is a critique, you're spiritually and creatively impoverished, is to the left. To say, the critique is necessary, and living embodied realities and creating embodied cultures is what's going to put theory into practice so we can learn in an iterative way, but that's what's also going to attract other people. Simply creating more binaries and more us versus them, we've seen where that's gotten us, right? The left is responsible for identity politics. We can say the right manipulates it and amplifies it. But in some ways, progressive groups were the originators of that. And understandably so. Oppressed and marginalized peoples have needed to organize their voice and say, we are being treated like other. And so the human reaction is that then other 1%ers, power elites, white supremacists, what have you. And we actually have to live out the embodiments of what it means to be in an anti-racist, anti-patriarchal, anti-capitalist culture. We have to live that out. And that requires creative spiritual imagination. And I know the word spiritual is anathema to many people, and we've conflated religiosity with spirituality, but I mean it in the broadest sense of spirit-based, of being connected to something that is beyond the three-dimensional, 5 sense, matter and form interaction that we have when we simply see this world in this linear, Cartesian, Newtonian sense. And that actually gesturing towards a more animistic, queer, quantum, relational worldview opens up possibilities. It opens up vistas and horizons that we can't see with our current ontology. And so there's not just a process of decolonization and deschooling and unlearning that is required, but a reattunement to our spirit bodies, to realms beyond the immediate. You could say subtle realms, or spirit realms, or ancestral realms. But there's other ways of knowing, being, sensing, and relating to the world that can inform us in ways we can't understand. And that requires humility. There's a line that came to me from a plant much smarter than me, and it said, "The seed of all ontology is ignorance. The seed of all ontology is ignorance. The seed of all worldviews is the recognition of how little we know." And so if the seed of all ontology is ignorance, the midwife of wisdom is humility. And as soon as we can move back into a position of humility, into a position of service for a broader ecosystem of the living world, then the animate universe can be in dialogue with us. Arrogance, confidence, certainty, ownership, private property, the kind of Occidental constructs, if they're so strong and we believe we know, then we can't actually learn from the ecology itself. And so that's how I'm using this term of a kind of a spirit-based political work, or a spiritual political praxis, because it's ongoing.